Before we have a look at the internal re-rendering process, let's have a look at how we can optimize performance with functional components though. Because should component update is a great tool, but it's only available in class-based components. Now what about functional components? What can we do there? What about the cockpit component? Because with the paint flashing, we see that, and I will disable this now, we see that of course the cockpit is never touched when I type here, but still we can tell that it executed its code. So how can we prevent this if nothing about the cockpit changed? And for that, we first of all have to look at the cockpit, and we see that the only thing that the cockpit uses internally and that therefore should trigger a re-rendering of the cockpit are the person's length here, and then also this title. The names of the persons and so on are totally irrelevant. So what can you do now to prevent this unnecessary re-rendering? React also has a tool for functional components. You can wrap your export, so your entire component here, in the cockpit.js file with React memo. This basically uses memoization, which is a technique where React will memoize, so basically store a snapshot of this component, and only if its input changes, it will re-render it. And otherwise, if these inputs do not change and some parent component wants to update this cockpit component, React will give back that stored component. So therefore now, initially, this of course runs because there is no stored data. And here it actually runs again. Now why is that? Because on the cockpit component, it only re-renders when its props change. But of course, one of the props we depend on is the persons. We only use the length, but that is not something React picks up here. To fix that, we can optimize the way we pass data into our cockpit though. Here on cockpit, instead of passing in the persons, we can pass in the person's length, let's say, which is this state person's length. So instead of determining the length inside of the cockpit, we do it outside of the cockpit now. And we only pass in person's length. This, of course, will now only change if the person's length here changes. So now back in the cockpit.js file, where I used props person's length, I use, well, props person's length, but this is now a separate property. There is no dot in between. I'm not accessing a length property here. This is a new prop I get. Now with that, we made that calculation, or we outsourced that calculation that used the complete persons array, which of course changes with every keystroke. We outsourced this into app.js, and now we only get data that does not change with every keystroke. And therefore now if I clear this, if I type here, we see nothing about cockpit.js being executed here. This will only happen once we do something that does affect the cockpit. So then you see that run, but you don't see any cockpit output for changes that do not relate to it. So React Memo is a great way of also getting optimization for your functional components, and therefore it is a good idea to wrap functional components that might not need to update with every change in the parent component with it.